on. I don't normally do personal introductions to the book reviews, but in this case I'm making an exception. So this book is called Painting Landscapes in Watercolour by Paul Talbot-Greaves, and I had the privilege of attending a workshop of Paul's the other week, and it's such an honour because Paul has just been accepted recently into the Royal Institute of Watercolourists, which is it's an incredible accolade, very hard to get in, and testament to Paul's talent. And the fact that he came to our local art group and did a whole workshop day with us was fabulous. And he's a wonderful, wonderful teacher. So if you do get the opportunity to go on one of his courses, I know he teaches all over the world, please do, because he on the day he taught us all about value and how to recognise value. It was brilliant. Now I'm not going to show you my painting because it's terrible. I'm going to have another go at it and then I might show it to you another day. So enough of me waffling, let's crack on and let's have a look inside. So what can I tell you about Paul? Paul Talbot-Greaves is a professional UK-based landscape painter, primarily working in watercolour, but he also works in acrylics and oils. He's celebrated for capturing the rugged beauty of the Yorkshire moors, using vibrant shadow-like contrasts and patterns in his compositions, arranged in an impressionistic yet representational style. In Paul's painting of the wharf near Kettlewell, he tells us that watercolour is the ideal medium for capturing the crisp effects of shimmering reflections in water, and Paul has certainly captured it in this beautiful painting. His work is just beautiful. This is a lovely book printed on quality paper with 176 pages. We have 8 main chapters dealing with watercolour, sketching and drawing, painting subjects, useful painting techniques, working with colour, atmosphere and the landscape, painting light, and building towards the painting. Paul explains that watercolour is incredibly versatile. It can create anything from really light, delicate, translucent washes right through to deep, rich, bold darks, which makes it such a perfect medium for landscape painting. And here's a really lovely acknowledgement from Paul. I won't read all of his thank yous out, but I will share this, in that he's dedicated this book to all his students, past and present, who he says have inadvertently taught him so much. I think this is a lovely sentiment. Paul gives us a really detailed introduction here, and it's beautifully illustrated with examples of his own paintings throughout. When it comes to landscape painting, his advice is to paint as yourself, to focus on the elements that interest you the most. He actually talks about how easy it is to fall into the trap of comparing your own style or skills with other artists, especially those you probably admire. But he believes that's more of a hindrance than a help. It doesn't really offer anything useful, except maybe when you're intentionally copying to figure out how a particular effect is achieved. His own approach to landscape painting is all about capturing his personal response to the landscape, simply observing and recording the patterns of tone, colour and shape that he sees in nature. Chapter 1, dealing with watercolour, opens with some really sensible advice from Paul about choosing your materials. He explains why going for cheap supplies is actually a false economy, and it's only going to hold you back and leave you frustrated and disappointed. Paul points out that paper is often the last thing people think about, but he really stresses that it's just as important as your paint and brushes. There's an example on the right-hand page where the paper Paul used has a damaged, scuffed surface, and you can see how that has caused problems. The paint didn't behave properly, leading to bleeding and fuzzy, uncontrolled edges in certain places. Paul goes on to explain that watercolour paper comes in all sorts of weights, textures and even shades. Some papers are brilliant white, while others have more of a soft off-white tone, and St Cuthbert's Mill even make a range of tinted watercolour papers too. Paul tends to work on bright white paper himself, because it keeps his colours looking clean, fresh and vibrant. And he reminds you, your paper isn't just something to paint on, it's actually one of your most valuable tools. Paul also shows us a selection of different brush sizes and shapes, and he talks about where he might use each one, or in some cases where he probably wouldn't use them in his own work. He also shares some really useful advice on how to look after your brushes, how to choose a mixing palette, and a few extra accessories you might want to consider adding to your kit. Paul then talks about the unique characteristics of watercolour and how it's quite different from other mediums. Unlike acrylic or oil, where you're often working with opaque blocks of colour, watercolour is all about transparent layers, letting the light of the paper shine through. And generally you work from light to dark. There are exceptions to that, of course, and Paul explains this really nicely by walking you through how he painted a lovely barn scene in Wharfdale. Here we have some really detailed advice on how to actually handle watercolour paint. As Paul says, the clue is in the name, watercolour. It's all about watery paint. He highlights some of the common mistakes that beginners often make, and I have to say, I love how he describes the painting on the right-hand page. He says, "Here the reflections of the mountains have been painted with disastrous results." It really made me smile. But of course, Paul doesn't just point out what's gone wrong, he also gives really practical advice on how to manage drying times and how to avoid streaky, uneven washes. Paul goes on to explain how to apply paint correctly, and he really emphasises how important it is to let your washes dry completely between layers. If you don't, you're far more likely to end up with unwanted brush marks or runbacks. Paul takes you through, step by step, how he created his painting Country Road. He explains how the whole piece was built up in 3 distinct layers, starting with the lightest tones and big open washes, then gradually adding mid-tones to bring in form and structure, finally finishing with darker accents and fine details to pull everything together. Chapter 2 is all about sketching and drawing, and I really like how Paul approaches this. He says, drawing isn't something you can or can't do, it's simply a skill that requires practice. Hands up, that's me. It's so often the people who say, "Oh, I can't draw," who've just been disappointed with their first attempts and have never really tried again. But Paul reminds us that improvement comes slowly but surely the more you keep giving it a try. Paul continues to say that simply drawing something for the sake of it probably isn't going to inspire you. So his advice is to start drawing the things you actually enjoy. And if you don't have the time, or let's be honest, the motivation to sit and draw every single day, even for just 10 minutes, then try instead to just start noticing shapes and look at how the different shapes relate to each other. That in itself is a form of practice. We begin with Paul introducing 3 different types of pencils: regular graphite pencil, water-soluble graphite and watercolour pencils. And he shares a little story from his own experience of sketching on plein air, that's painting outdoors. If you look at the image on the bottom right, you'll notice some strange marks in the sky. Well, that's actually where ice formed on the wash Paul laid down. It must have been very cold that day. Paul often uses watercolour paint itself to create quick sketches, and when you combine that with water-soluble graphite and watercolour pencils, it can really bring your sketches to life and make the final image more appealing. He says after a while, sketching in watercolour just becomes second nature, and you start to relax about mistakes. And this made me smile. If you can control a wash while crouched in the corner of a field with the wind and rain lashing at your back, then you can definitely handle a wash in the comfort of your own home. He also describes experimenting with other materials too, such as watercolour sticks, charcoal and Conte crayon, all of which have their own qualities for adding texture and expression. Paul also mentions about working with pen and ink, and there's a lovely little example top left where he's used a simple felt tip pen, sketched with it and then softened parts of it by washing the ink into certain areas with a wet brush. Over on the right hand page there's a photograph of Paul's general sketching kit. A simple way to block out the overwhelming panoramic view and focus in on a smaller, more manageable section of the landscape, or if you don't have one, just use 2 L-shaped pieces of card. A viewfinder is a handy little tool to have in your kit. When it comes to sketching outdoors for the first time, Paul understands that a lack of confidence is probably the biggest obstacle you'll face, but he reassures you that most people are either supportive or they simply won't say anything at all. He also shares some fun anecdotes from his own outdoor sketching experiences. Before you set off on your own outdoor sketching adventure, Paul suggests it's a good idea to have a plan. And whilst he's out on location, he often writes notes directly on his sketches as memory aids for when he's back in the studio. Painting outdoors definitely comes with its own set of challenges, and here Paul explains how he handles them. One great tip he gives is to make a quick sketch map of the lighting, because as we know, it can change really fast. The finished painting on the bottom left was actually done entirely on location. Paul says that the winter morning light shifted so quickly he was really glad he'd taken the time to sketch where the light was at the start. Paul comes back to how important good drawing skills are. He reminds us that while sketching should be about freedom and expression, it's really helpful to carefully plot angles, shapes and lines, especially if you want to scale your sketch up later and transfer it to your watercolour paper. He even shares a practical tip, using a sliding thumb and pencil to measure and compare the proportions of objects in your scene. And here, Paul walks you through 3 handy methods to help scale up your drawing or photograph. We have the grid method, tracing, or using a projector. Each has its own benefits, and Paul explains when and how you might want to use them to get your proportions just right. Paul goes a bit deeper here, offering more guidance on creating a strong drawing. He talks about really learning to draw what you see, building up a solid framework, and using careful contour shading to bring out the slopes and angles in your scene. Paul offers some solid advice about working from photographs, but warns against relying on them too much. He says photos are great for capturing fleeting moments, like changing light or weather, but they shouldn't be your only reference. He also explains the difference between using an optical zoom lens and a digital zoom lens, and how you can use the zoom on your camera to help compose your photograph in preparation for a painting. Digital photos can be really useful because you can tweak and manipulate them using computer software. Take the fishing boats on the top left. They make a really colourful subject, but Paul thought the background was too busy, so he removed it and replaced it with just the ocean. This helped Paul get a realistic idea of how his finished painting might look. The painting on the left-hand page is called Waterfall, Churchbeck, Coniston. It's 11.5 by 8 inches, and I think the colour in this one is absolutely beautiful. Which brings us to Chapter 3, Painting Subjects. Now this isn't a step-by-step how to paint section. Instead, Paul's focus here is really about sharing ideas and offering inspiration to help you interpret the landscape in your own unique way. It's more about the thought process behind capturing the essence of a place rather than copying it exactly. I think that's a really good approach, especially if you're trying to find your own style. And Paul shares a lovely series of little anecdotes about his own adventures out in the mountains, trying to capture the mood and atmosphere that you can only really experience when you're right there in the landscape. Alongside this, he offers some very sage advice about the basic kit you'll need if you're planning to head outdoors and give this a go yourself. Things like being prepared for the weather, keeping your materials simple and portable. All those practical tips that can make the difference between a really enjoyable painting expedition and one that turns into a bit of a disaster. Including buildings in a landscape helps to show scale and add atmosphere. For example, a cosy cottage in a snowy scene. Paul explains how he paints stonework by mixing colours loosely on the paper, then layering just enough detail. If you look at the painting on the bottom left, he hasn't painted every single brick, just enough to suggest the texture of the stone wall on the French chateau. Drawing buildings can be tricky because you do need to get the perspective right, but as Paul says, you don't have to be an accomplished draftsman. You just need a basic understanding of eye level and vanishing points. With the help of clear illustrations, Paul explains it here in a simple, easy to follow way. Water always adds something special in a painting, The key to capturing still water is combining wet in wet with a careful wet on dry approach to create a lovely glassy effect. In Paul's painting of the River Dee in Dentdale, you can see how clean, deliberate washes reflect the light in the trees, with the pebbles clearly showing through the shallow water. It's cleverly done. And Paul explains exactly how he achieved this. While this chapter does not contain step-by-step projects for you to follow along with, Paul provides plenty of clear information, enough for you to try the techniques yourself and apply them in your own work. Having had the privilege of attending 2 of Paul's workshops myself, what really stands out for me in his teaching is how he focuses on the fundamentals, core techniques and principles. His aim isn't to teach you to paint like him or like anybody else, but to give you the skills to develop your own unique style. Personally, I think this is the essence of what makes a really good teacher. Paul goes on to explain how to capture moving and falling water, as well as how to paint a seascape with all its different moods. Seascapes often have a real sense of charm and serenity. If you look at the painting bottom right, you'll see how Paul has cleverly used patterns in the seaweed and the shapes of the clouds to lead your eye towards Lindisfarne Castle. The still water left by the tide also gave Paul the perfect opportunity to add some gentle reflections. Boats are notoriously tricky to draw unless you're looking at them side on or from a distance, and because boat designs vary so much, there's no single formula to follow. In the bottom right, Paul explains how he tackles this. He starts by marking the centre points of the key angles, which helps you judge the shapes and curves more accurately. These become simple construction lines to build the boat around. I found this incredibly helpful. I've never seen it explained like this before. It's actually encouraged me to have a go at painting boats in future. That's something that I usually avoid. Trees are such an integral part of the landscape, you can't really avoid them. They can be a useful focal point as well, or even the main subject. Paul explains how to approach painting trees so they'll look natural and believable throughout the different seasons. Animals can be really useful in a painting, not just to add interest but also to give a sense of scale, like cattle against a wide open plain. The painting top right is called Sheep. Paul spotted them on a rainy day, huddled together in a farmyard. The rain had made the farmer's dye run down their backs, turning their fleeces all sorts of shades of blue. He couldn't resist taking a few photos, which later inspired this lovely semi-abstract painting. I really admire how Paul has captured the light in the painting on the left called Around Malham Tarn. He's used a mix of washes, stippling and paint removal techniques to create that lovely shimmering effect of sunlight and shade. What I love is that he doesn't try to paint everything too precisely. Paul uses simple, effective techniques to capture the essence of the scene. This leads us perfectly into the next section, Chapter 4, Useful Painting Techniques. Paul says that painting is really about freedom of expression. When a painting becomes too tight or overworked, it can lose that lively, spontaneous feel. In this chapter, he shares a range of useful techniques to help capture different textures and effects you'll often find in the landscape. It begins with dry brush, splattering and scumbling, 3 techniques that are just perfect for creating the look of a heavily textured foreground. Another technique is to soften edges to create smooth blends, perfect for things like distant hills fading into the sky. Paul also covers using resists, like masking fluid or wax, to preserve highlights, but he does advise using them with care, as they can sometimes affect the painting over time and deteriorate. I actually ruined a watercolour portrait of my dad once by leaving masking fluid on the paper far too long. It was months, we're talking months, and now it just won't come off. Pressing cellophane food wrap into a variegated wet wash creates some really interesting textures, like the background trees in the golf course painting top right. And dropping salt into a wet wash exaggerates that frosty, icy feel. You can see this in the painting bottom right. Paul occasionally uses masking fluid, but only when it's too fiddly to paint around a shape to preserve the lighter areas. Most of the time he prefers negative painting, as it gives a much livelier result. In his painting of this bluebell wood, Paul splattered masking fluid loosely where he wanted the bluebells to be, and also applied it to areas where the foliage needed to stand out against the dark tree trunks. Once the main painting was finished, Paul removed the masking fluid and gently tinted the shapes to suggest the bluebells and also the foliage. This technique really helped to keep the flowers looking fresh and bright. You can also use masking tape to create perfectly straight lines, or if you tear it, rugged edges for things like rocks. But you need to be careful, as the tape can sometimes damage the paper. A good tip is to pass the tape onto your clothes a few times to reduce the stickiness, and warming it with a hairdryer or a heat gun before peeling it off can really help prevent tearing. Using these various techniques is all well and good, but actually controlling your brush is just as important. Paul explains how different brushes behave differently and recommends some simple brush control exercises to help you get a feel for how your brushes handle the paint. Negative painting is really key in watercolour. It's all about placing darks carefully to make the lights stand out. In this painting, top right, the dark interior of the barn creates a negative shape around the cattle, and the cattle in turn form negative shapes around the straw piled up in the foreground. In watercolour, you're always looking for those dark tones to help the lighter ones pop. There are two negative painting exercises here. Exercise 1 is a photo of a snow scene. Paul asks, what do you see first? Most people will say trees, hills, sky, people, road, but he explains that's actually looking at the photograph the wrong way. Instead, you need to focus on the interplay between the light and dark shapes. For example, do you notice how the tree trunks on the left are lighter than the dense mass of twigs above them? Paul mentions that it's perfectly normal to spend more time on planning a painting than actually painting it, such as in the second negative painting exercise, which shows a path through a forest. The way all the light and dark shapes interact can be quite complex, so careful planning will really help you to get it right. Wet in wet is one of those techniques that makes watercolour so magical. Paul explains how to use it with more control and how to avoid some of the common pitfalls. A lovely example is his painting Late Summer in Wharfdale on the right-hand page. The soft moody sky was created using wet in wet, and by tilting the board at a steep angle, Paul allowed the paint to form those lovely streaks of rain as the paint ran down the paper. Here Paul illustrates an example of a classic run-back where colour has been applied as the paper is drying. On the right-hand page is Paul's beautiful painting of angled tarn. He's used the wet in wet technique to great effect to convey the soft blurry reflections of the tarn in the water. Paul's striking painting across the fields at Martindale perfectly illustrates why a good understanding of colour mixing is so important, especially when it comes to handling all the different greens in a landscape. In Chapter 5, Working with Colour, Paul opens by saying that colour mixing is the bane of an artist's life. That did amuse me. He starts by explaining parent colours, the primaries of red, yellow and blue, whilst reminding us that not all reds, yellows and blues are the same. Paul shares his own colour palette, illustrated in the colour wheel on the left-hand page. Around the wheel he's shown how adding Payne's grey to each colour in varying amounts will deepen the tones. On the right-hand page is a helpful exercise showing how to darken a colour, in this case phthalo blue, without shifting its colour bias, demonstrating how you can create rich, deep tones without turning the colour muddy or dull. Across these two pages, Paul demonstrates how he mixes two of his most used colours, browns and greens. He shows how varying the proportions of different parent colours can produce a wide range of natural harmonious mixes that are ideal for landscapes. In his painting Autumn Shade, Hardcastle Crags, Paul used a limited palette of burnt sienna, lemon yellow, sap green, French ultramarine and light red, intermixing these to create a variety of natural tones. He also added Payne's grey where needed to the mix to deepen the darker shades. On the right hand page, Paul shares examples of several popular colours he's analysed. It's worth noting that the results are specific to the brand of paint he's using. The painting on the left hand page is predominantly green, but Paul has kept the colours fresh and vibrant by using a palette green as a base, then mixing in yellows and blues to create subtle variations. Paul shares some simple rules to help you mix your palette colours more effectively and gain more confidence. And Paul explains the colour mixes he used to create these two beautiful paintings, one in low key with soft subdued tones and the other in a high key, bright and full of light. A flat wash of a single colour can make a painting look dull and boring. Paul recommends mixing colours directly on the paper. This will help to bring life and vibrancy to your work. He also points out that using a limited palette will encourage you to be creative and more inventive with your colour selection. For the painting on the left-hand page, Paul used just 3 colours: French ultramarine, light red and sap green. He explains that if you've never tried working with a limited palette before, it's a valuable exercise. It really teaches you how to use your colours wisely and encourages much more creative colour mixing. We've now reached Chapter 6, Atmosphere and the Landscape. Notice how Paul has exaggerated the sky in the painting A Summer Storm on the left to create a sense of drama and mood. This use of a bold, expressive sky immediately sets the tone for the whole landscape. I absolutely love Paul's painting on the left-hand page. It's called A Wet Day at Little Langdale. He's captured the atmosphere of a damp day in the UK perfectly, that soft grey light mixed with gentle pastel tones. On the right-hand page, Paul demonstrates how he created a moody painting of Stonehenge, completely transforming the scene from the bright summer's day in his reference photograph. By changing the sky and the season, he's evoked an entirely different mood and sense of drama. Atmosphere can be as simple as a change in light or weather, yet it profoundly affects how a landscape appears. The sky especially plays a key role in conveying the mood you want to capture. Here Paul provides a step-by-step demonstration of how he painted this simple landscape. From there, he goes on to explain further techniques for painting skies. Paul covers different types of skies, from two-step skies and plain skies, to deciding when to paint a big dramatic sky or when to keep it simple and subtle. In Snow on Wadsworth Moor, the plain simple sky perfectly complements the brightness of the day. Paul achieved this effect with a wash of cobalt blue that gently graduates into Naples yellow near the horizon. Paul explains how he approaches painting sunsets and sunrises, highlighting the subtle differences between the two. For a sunrise, he usually begins with an overall wash of red and yellow. Because these pigments can be very intense, he cautions you to use them carefully to avoid creating an unrealistic and unnatural effect. Snow scenes often invite exaggeration, especially with mood-enhancing skies. Since white reflects ultraviolet light, shadows in snowy landscapes usually appear blue or violet. For the brightest effects, Paul recommends using a brilliant white paper like Bockingford, which gives maximum contrast between light and dark. The white of the paper becomes the snow, while the rest of the painting builds up from the shadows and darks. Misty low cloud or fog can be a great tool for landscape artists, not only to create atmosphere, but also to obscure parts of a background that don't add to the main focus of the painting. Paul shares an interesting anecdote about how he deliberately used mist to partially hide an element in one of his landscape scenes that wasn't enhancing the composition. If you want to know what it was, you'll have to buy his book, and the answer's on page 142. Alongside this story, Paul offers several useful techniques for painting mist effectively. Chapter 7, Painting Light. Capturing light is often what makes or breaks a painting. Paul explains that it's not about how much light you put into a painting, but how dark you make your darks. The darker your darks, the lighter your lights will appear. Paul recommends practicing control of your tones. Ideally, you should work with just 5 tones in a painting. graded from light, mid-light, mid-tone, mid-dark to dark. Before you begin painting, identify where these tonal areas will be. The beautiful painting on the right-hand page, Approaching Dent, demonstrates the full use of a tonal range, from the light tones of the sunlit wall on the right, through the mid-tones in the background, to the darkest tones under the main tree. I think this painting's just lovely. Paul reminds us that mastering tonal work is a very important element of successful painting. Here he explains 3 methods for building up a tonal scale, and he encourages you to practice them so you can develop better control over light and shadow. Here Paul explains how to paint realistic shadows. A cast shadow always relates to the colour of the surface it falls on, and when a shadow crosses different coloured areas, its hue changes accordingly. In the painting on the left, notice how the shadows on the towpath become more intense closer to the light source. In the painting on the right, observe how the cast shadow reveals the slope and angle of the right-hand wall. Paul has provided a handy checklist for you to follow the next time you go to paint shadows. Paul's painting on the right, simply titled The Towpath, perfectly captures a typical scene along an English canal. I'm quite familiar with this subject and very proud to say I'm descended from narrowboat people on my mother's side. My great-grandfather was the last family member working along the cut. Paul built this painting using a handful of carefully applied techniques, explaining that it required a good deal of planning and forethought before he even began to paint. And this is what Chapter 8 is all about, building towards a painting. Paul shares that one of the most common comments he hears during his workshops, courses and demonstrations is something along the lines of, "Oh, he's painted that in less than an hour." But what people don't always appreciate is that it's taken Paul over 20 years of practice and experience to develop his level of skill with watercolour. Paul suggests one of the best and quickest ways to improve your own skills is to create study sheets, simple pages where you focus on practicing just one element, such as trees, skies, buildings or shadows. Annotate these studies with details about the colours and techniques you've used, and always remember to add the date. This not only tracks your progress, but also helps you notice your growth over time. Here is one of Paul's own study sheets, where he practiced different techniques in order to represent the reflections in the brown water in the canal. And here's another important tip. If something doesn't turn out how you hoped, don't write things like, "This is terrible," in frustration. Instead, critique your work constructively, as if you were giving helpful feedback to a friend. You wouldn't say "that's terrible" to a friend, but you might say something like, "I think you need to improve the contrast in the values," or "the edges here could be softer." This mindset encourages growth rather than disappointment and helps you develop a more objective and useful way of assessing your own work. One of the things that often holds beginners back when learning watercolour is the common belief that mistakes can't be fixed. And whilst there's some truth to that, it's not the whole story. Paul explains there's actually quite a lot you can do to rescue a painting. Over these 2 pages he shares some really helpful tips for correcting mistakes, softening edges or lifting out colour, or even disguising the problem. Paul reaffirms that doing regular studies will absolutely improve both your technique and skill. He recommends setting yourself small projects, like studying trees through the different seasons. I think this is a wonderful practical exercise to work on over time and keep in a dedicated sketchbook. Paul also reminds us that your artwork will always look better when framed, and he offers some really helpful guidance on how to present and display your artwork so it looks its absolute best. Success with watercolour is very much rooted in planning, the planning of your composition and the planning of the techniques you'll use to bring it to life. You wouldn't build a house without a detailed set of plans to follow, would you? Top left is a reference photo of Pen y Ghent viewed in the distance from Ingleborough. Paul began with a quick thumbnail sketch, bringing the distant mountain closer to strengthen his composition, and from there he constructed his painting based on the thumbnail, using the photograph mainly for colour and detail reference. When designing your composition, Paul reminds us of a few key things to consider when planning your painting. These include placing a focal point along the rule of thirds, such as a tree or building, and supporting that focal point with a lead-in, like the curve of a road or a winding path. This helps guide the viewer's eye into the scene. Here Paul describes how he planned one of his paintings. He started with his reference photograph in the top left. He was interested in the L-shaped composition created by the tree and the building. His first instinct was to remove the gates on the left and the background buildings to place more focus on the main building itself. To test the idea, Paul sketched a quick thumbnail using an ink pen to visualise how the simplified scene might look. Happy with the line drawing, he then wanted to check whether his colour scheme would work. Using watercolour and an ordinary black colouring pencil, he created a quick colour study to see how things might come together. Paul explains that working through these kinds of preparatory sketches really helps keep the final painting process smooth and focused. For me personally, this chapter alone has been one of the most valuable takeaways from Paul's book. In the past, I've just charged right into a painting only to be disappointed. In future, I will certainly adopt the lessons Paul has shared with us here. When you are painting, Paul advises referring to your thumbnail sketches far more than relying on your photographs. Your sketch will capture the essence of the composition you planned, simplifying details, enhancing focal points and guiding the overall balance of the painting. To help with this, Paul provides a very useful compositional awareness checklist for you to refer to as you work. And Paul concludes his wonderful book by sharing that his own introduction to watercolour was, in his words, a great disappointment that hit me square in the face. Paul had assumed it would be easy, but rather than giving up, he rose to the challenge, and now, over 30 years later, he's still learning. Paul reminds us that painting is absolutely something that can be learned, but as much as we all would like to paint like a master, or like our heroes, there are no shortcuts. The secret is simply practice, practice, practice. Sadly, we've now come to the end of Paul's incredible book. What attracted me to his book in the first place was the way Paul creates such a strong value structure in his art, with his unique, bold and vibrant style. And knowing what an excellent teacher Paul is, I was certain his book would be a keeper. I really hope my review has inspired you to buy your own personal copy of Painting Landscapes in Watercolour, and in the description below I've put links to where you can buy Paul's book. It's a valuable addition to any artist's library, and I'm certainly going to employ several of the lessons he's shared the next time I get my watercolours out. I've also included a link to Paul's website, where you'll find a wonderful blog that's definitely worth a visit. There you can explore his teaching holidays and online video courses. Plus, in the description, I've added links to an interview with Paul, to one of his painting demos on YouTube, and his social media channels. I hope you found this review helpful. If you did, please give the video a like. It really helps YouTube share it with others who enjoy art books too. I post a new art book review every week, so if you'd like to see more, do consider subscribing. I truly appreciate it. If you found the review helpful, please feel free to leave a comment below. I reply to everyone. And if there's an art book you'd like me to feature, just let me know. I'll do my best to review it for you. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy painting.